Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Murshak. Today we'll be speaking with Oliver Traldi. Oliver is a philosophy PhD candidate at Notre Dame, as well as an essayist and columnist for Art Digital. We're talking today about the state of the intellectual dark web. We talked about the origins of the IDW, who's in it, whether it's still a thing, possible points of failure in trying to have the open discussion, the paradox of anti-tribalism, the regressive left, platform wars, symbiosis of polarization, the threat of the far right, the dissident left, and the populist realignment. Strap in. The audio on this track is sketchy in some parts, and unfortunately Oliver was experiencing some connectivity issues that interrupted the conversation. I will never cut out dialogue from a conversation with a guest, but I did my best to splice and edit the patchy parts of this talk together. So please bear with us for any roughness in the sound. I thought it was a worthwhile conversation to broadcast nonetheless. As usual, if you're a fan of the show, if you listen to the show, if it's adding value to your life and you want to hear more conversations like this, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Without further ado, I give you Oliver Traldi. Welcome to Agora Politics. This is your host, Alex Murshak. Today I'm speaking with Oliver Traldi. Oliver is a PhD candidate in philosophy at Notre Dame University, as well as a writer, an essayist, a columnist for Art Digital. Oliver, welcome to Agora Politics.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you on. Just a little bit of background on how we got introduced to each other. You and I actually only know each other from Twitter. That's primarily where we've interacted and corresponded, and we have a lot of mutually overlapping interests as well as contacts in that realm of the online space. So I was prompted to invite you on the show because I had read a review that you wrote for National Review online on the limits of Dave Reuben's cultural politics. And that review, for one, it pointed out some things to me that I had sort of thought in my own head, but I hadn't actually articulated yet about Dave Reuben, and we'll get into that later. But more than that, it brought to mind this question of what is the state of the intellectual dark web right now as an idea, as a movement, as a group, because it seems to me like it's sort of fraying in multiple ways, and I'm not sure that the original intent of the group, as it was sort of idealized or created, is necessarily existent anymore. And so I wanted to work through that problem with you in real time here, in front of the audience, and also just get your perspective, obviously as an individual, on the state of that movement, what you think about it. I know you've written critically as well about Jordan Peterson and some others, and obviously in this article on Dave Reuben, which I'm referring to, you also bring up Bret Weinstein and some of the other people that are sort of loosely or in various ways connected to this group. So I guess before we get into that, do we want to just go over real quick what the intellectual dark web is? I don't know. Do you have a quick quip to say about that?
Yeah, I actually think in a way it's a good question because the question of who's in it when it started and stuff is not, it's not particularly well defined. Not that these sorts of labels always are. Obviously, well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously, depending on what the listeners already know, but one of the sort of founding events was a New York Times article written by Barry Weiss in, I think it was early 2018, maybe March of 2018 or something like that. And that had included Bret Weinstein, as you said, and his brother Eric, Claire Lemon, the editor of Quillette, Dave Reuben, as we said, Jordan Peterson, as we said, Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, Michael Shermer, the editor of Skeptic Magazine, and maybe a few others who I've forgotten.
Yeah, so the core group was sort of these, I guess, independent thinkers, or I guess primarily they coalesced around critiques of the left or excesses of
Yeah,
leftist politics.
yeah. So I should,
Um,
So the first thing I should have said is, everybody in this space, the people who were in the article, as well as the people who weren't, and I include myself in this, as well as some of the people who have been critical of, like, like Jordan Peterson and like James Lindsay.
That's interesting.
And Peter Boghossian, who have their book.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say they have their book on the Impossible Conversations, which is largely a book about kind of how to address these political conversations and how to kind of open up a space to talk about ideas from social justice. So where should I pick up again?
You were elaborating on kind of the members of the intellectual dark web and the way it had gotten started. I have some additional things to say about it, but I was going to let you finish.
Yeah. So I think the main thing I was going to say, which I should have started with, was just that, one of the unifying features of this group, which is also, it's also true of me, even though I'm also critical of some of the members of the group, is that everybody kind of writes critically of what you might call the identity politics left or the social justice left. There's some skepticism about anti-racism. So, for example, Coleman Hughes, and not that there are people who are proponents of racism, but there's some skepticism of anti-racism.
Coleman Hughes is black, by the way.
Coleman Hughes and John McWhorter have written about anti-racism as a kind of religion. There's some skepticism of feminism. So Christina Hoff Sommers was in the original article, and she's been a skeptic of what she calls gender feminism since the 1990s. And so that's another interesting thing, which is that it's not clear kind of how much of what's going on in this space is new versus how much is kind of recapitulating culture wars that were already kind of full throttle in the 90s. Sorry, that's a little bit of a digression. So I'll let you add to that.
Well, yeah, so actually this is an interesting place to start because I think you and I actually have slightly different conceptualizations of what the IDW is and even who's in it. Mm-hmm. From my mind, I felt like the group was a little bit more limited to more or less the people that were mentioned in that first New York Times article. As I understand it, it originated with Eric Weinstein, who coined it, I believe, actually originally on a podcast with Sam Harris, and then made it sort of more popularized by appearing on Joe Rogan later. And the New York Times article, I believe, was actually written shortly after that Joe Rogan appearance. And I would say that Barry Weiss is even, somewhat. I mean, she's not really technically in the group because insofar as they define themselves as being outside of mainstream institutions,
right?
Being in the New York Times means that you can't fit that definition. But she's definitely a huge node in terms of trying to, expose or shed light on this, decentralized collective that's attempting to reboot sense making. So I actually view the intellectual dark web as less a explicitly anti-social justice left political project and more of an epistemological project. It seems to me like the common thread, the reason why freedom of speech is so important with this group across the board, even though they have very different political ideologies, seems to be this idea of, well, we can't throw away the tools and the culture that we have that's allowed us to make the progress that we've made so far. And they view these aggressive strains of left-wing ideology as, I would say, anti-civilizational, in that they, the postmodern aspects of it that embrace sort of emotionality and reject logic and reason and the ability to even understand one another on any real basis. Those to me seem like the things that they're actually most interested in preserving. And it also seems to me that the group was originally, it was by design meant to include people on the left and the right. So you've got Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, who are both, lifelong progressives, almost communist level lefties. I mean, they come from a communist family. They both say that. And on the other side, you've got people like Ben Shapiro, who's sort of a, neocon, and you've got Jordan Peterson, who's more of a traditionalist in many ways, even though he sort of has a very solid materialist grounding in science. But the issue, so there are two core issues that I wanted to bring up with you about whether or not the intellectual dark web, as it was imagined, still exists. When Eric Weinstein coined the term, he said that they were the vanguard, and that this was going to be the first group of people that were going to step out and say something. And I do agree that many of the people in this group were saying things that other people are just now coming around to, in some cases 3 or 4 years later, that people were just afraid to say or unwilling to say because they didn't think it was so much of a big problem. And so I want to give them credit for that. But in terms of it being a non-ideological, explicitly non-political project, that's the first point where I think they're starting to fail and where it's really frayed. And I think Dave Rubin is the primary example of that, because he's somebody that I've seen transform from his original sort of play, which was basically, I was a lefty my whole life. I was involved in the Young Turks, and I was betrayed by the left. That was sort of what I got from Dave when I first started following him years ago, which was here was the guy who was sort of disillusioned with what he thought were liberal ideals that were shared by the people who he thought were on his side, quote unquote. And then he found himself, as he often says, politically homeless, right?
Right.
And so
that's the phrase. Yeah, a lot of us felt that way maybe 5 years ago or so. It's something I've talked about with like other kind of IDW adjacent people like Kathy Young, Lowry. It's a phrase that people used. So I think what I would say is there's sort of two ways in which this avoidance of politics can break down. And before I talk about that, I should also say that one critique of the IDW, the conceptual critique will give, which is the idea that, like, you can't avoid politics. There's no avoiding politics. Politics is, like, in everything. That I don't like. That idea is, like, one of my main... That's something that I try to attack whenever I feel that I can find it. I don't think politics is in everything. I think you can avoid politics. But that doesn't mean that it's easy, and it doesn't mean that people are always successful at it. So there's two ways that you can kind of fail at it. The big, which I think is what we've seen with Reuben, is that so take this group that kind of is around this open discussion, and they feel that this open discussion is sort of tamped down by by this group, the social justice or identity politics crowd, or the part of the left. What does Dave call it? The regressive left. The part of the left that made him leave the left, right? So the really bad thing that can happen is that you decide that this group is really bugging you and is making it harder to talk honestly about certain topics, and you just kind of shift against them on every topic, not just the topics where they made it hard to talk about, but you just sort of push back against them on everything. And in a way, I feel that that's what happened with Reuben. Reuben, for a while he would say things like, look, I still have left-wing politics. I still like Bernie Sanders. I still want universal health care and things like this. My only concern is that the left has been consumed by this anti-free speech stuff, this social justice stuff, and that's what I'm pushing back against. Read his book, that is no longer what he says, right? He's sort of become basically a libertarian. And he's sort of become a libertarian reaction to leaving this one group and joining this other group, right? And so that's one way in which it can be political, which is just that if you leave one group of people for another, then you're going to adopt some beliefs of the new group and leave some beliefs that were common in the old group.
Yeah.
That's the idea of, that's one way. So this connects with the idea, another kind of critique with the IDW. So we talked about this idea of political homelessness. Another way of saying that is, so the intellectual dark web kind of phrases its critique of political culture in some ways as being about what they call tribalism, or I should say what we call tribal, right?
Or
So what is tribal? Yeah, anti-tribalism, exactly. So what do we mean by tribalism? Well, it just means that, you kind of your own. There's people in your political group, and they can kind of do no wrong, and people on the other side can't do anything right. And you just sort of assume you can never talk to the people on the other side, you can never have a good debate, and you never need to reconsider your own views like that, right? So politics is just this kind of war of group against group. There's certain groups on the left, certain groups on the right. Then when you get into these conversations with new people, you sort of take on some of their beliefs. And that's just kind of human nature. And the other way in which the kind of critique of politics can fail is, I think, a matter of focus. And this one is kind of a lot harder to manage, and it's not something that I'm good at managing myself. It's a lot harder to manage what you focus on. It's not something I'm good at myself. So a lot of people like Brett Weinstein and like me to a certain extent, we come into the IDW, whether it's the small IDW like Brett is in, or the kind of IDW diaspora or whatever you would call it that I'm in. And we say, look, we're lefties. We like Bernie Sanders. We think it would be good if everybody got health care, but we also are opposed to this regressive stuff. We also are in favor of free speech and stuff like that. And then kind of what happens is, well, we don't really ever talk about the lefty stuff because we're sort of really into this other stuff. For some reason, that's what grabs us, right? It really interests me kind of on a personal and intellectual level to be in these arguments with the more regressive elements of the left, right? And to explain why I think they're wrong about things, and to kind of level my critiques of their ideas and things like that. Whereas my interest in universal healthcare is not something that I have like much to say about. It determines how I vote, but like ultimately how you vote, it's just something you do, for most of us, it's just something you think about for a little while and then you do once a year, right? Or even less than that, for a lot of us. And so there's a kind of difficulty with focus there because, am I really on the left if I spend 364 days a year focusing on these critiques, and then I have one day where I focus on voting for somebody who's on the left. So that's another way in which the kind of the supposed universality of the IDW project can fail is if the progressives and the lefties involved in it kind of lost the ability to focus on that aspect of beliefs. And we should note that like the right wingers in the IDW have that ability, right? Like Ben Shapiro, it's not like he can no longer think about all the political topics he's interested in, and he can only think about critiquing social justice. He can still think about any element of politics, right? He still talks about libertarianism in all of its guises. He can still talk and spend a lot thinking about gun control and healthcare policy and things like that. And it's just this strange thing that happens to people who kind of come to the IDW from the left, where you sort of lose the ability to focus on these other issues.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely found myself, going through lots of different political transitions. I think the most disappointing thing for me is when you're somebody who feels like you either are in the IDW or you're part of the IDW diaspora, or you're sort of the next generation of people who are trying to take on a platform.
Right.
And you see someone like Dave Rubin, who goes from saying, I'm politically homeless, it sucks not having a tribe, it's really lonely out here, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
And of course it is. You are vulnerable, you are exposed, you are likely to get crushed if you go up against something large and you don't have anyone else around you. But when when you're moving through your own phases on this, and I've certainly had a large political transition from what I would say is my exodus from the left. And right now, I wouldn't even consider myself to be on the left, although I do think the left-right dynamic is a little outdated anyway. And so there's sort of a post-political project that we're all kind of involved in now. But when I see someone like Dave, who was a big inspiration initially, and who was able to create this really successful platform, the Reuben Report, which has I think 1 million subscribers on YouTube. It's huge.
It's incredibly successful.
Yeah, and now when I see someone like that going to TPUSA events, then and getting paid to go speak with Charlie Kirk, it's kind of you really lose faith in whether or not there is a genuine post-political sort of can we move past tribalism project happening, because it seems to me like he felt that uncertainty, he felt that fear, and then instead of and by the way, I don't want to make this show about crapping on Dave Rubin. I have a lot of respect for what he's done. It really makes you lose hope as someone who is following this guy, that anybody is actually going to be able to that the IDW is genuinely committed to what they're saying they're going to do, but that anybody can actually do it. What do you think of that?
Yeah. So the question of whether anybody can actually do it, I mean, it's a difficult one. We would think about just, what would it look like if somebody successful, would they just not talk about politics at all, or would they talk about politics in a different way? One thing in particular, I do agree that, I think it's best to avoid, nobody should treat Reuben as though, so I think that, a lot of people in the IDW have been critical of Reuben, right? Brett Weinstein has, I think Sam Harris maybe just a little bit, Quillette has written critical articles of him, and I think that although a lot of the critiques are correct, I also think they're convenient because, what happened to Reuben is just sort of like a more obvious version of the difficulties that everybody had kind of in this space. And there's a little bit of, you critique, if you want to be an anti-tribalist and you start worrying that actually the IDW is just a new political tribe that you're in, well, it's good to, okay, well, in that case, if I were really so tribalistic, would I be able to throw this guy in my tribe under the bus? No. So therefore I'm not tribalistic, right? So I think there's a sort of performativity to going too hard after, and the other thing so hard after him is he's not really, and this was obvious reading his book. He didn't become well known for having any of his own ideas, right? He became well known for having a good idea of who to bring on his show and having a skill at drawing other people's ideas out of him, right? He's always been a great interviewer. Seems to be like a charming, guy in person, kind of inspires personal loyalty from the people he interviews.
I mean, I'll just say it. My frustration with Reuben is just that when you're watching him, it's out of all the IDW thinkers, I mean, it really feels like you're just getting a high school civics lesson,
right,
with some libertarianism thrown in, and I understand he's had some really interesting guests on, but in general, you don't get a lot of generativeness out of Reuben in the same way you get out of some of the IDW members. Although I will say
Right.
that, it's not like Joe Rogan is necessarily opining on political discourses either. The fact that he's in this group, again, is more related to the fact that he has this large platform and he's sort of
Right.
independent, which we can get into that. That seems to be closing. Not that he's necessarily an intellectual of any kind.
Right. Yeah, the thing about platforms, I think, is interesting because, a couple of years ago, so you had Reuben growing, and you had Rogan growing, you had Quillette growing, right? And you had a bunch of other people kind of trying to start their own things. And I think things looked very hopeful for new platforms a couple of years ago. I'm not sure how right now, right? Like, I'm not sure. Things can look very good if a lot of these new platforms are starting, and then suddenly it can look like, oh, well, that's kind of all the oxygen that was in the room, right? So it may be that kind of like all of the energy and all of the, anybody who would want to donate money, anybody who would want to pay for a subscription or anything, it may have been that all of those people were kind of already, all that space was kind of already taken up, in early 2018, and there just was there was no room for expansion after that, and that's very hard to predict. That. Okay, so I don't talk business strategy with people who run these platforms, but you can kind of tell when one of these platforms is kind of trying to expand to a new audience, when they're kind of trying to find new donors in a new way and things like that. And I don't know how they've been. And that's not to say, I think Quillette has been incredibly successful. It has an incredible reach, publishes a lot of really, really interesting articles. And I think the question is just, at what point are there no longer, at what point have you found your readers, and it's going to be difficult to find anymore. One thing to say right now, and I know we're going to mostly avoid current politics, but given the topic of media independence, it's very hard to in the current moment. So one of the, Quillette started kind of around. So I think of the founding of Quillette as kind of like the start of the intellectual dark web in a way.
Oh, interesting. I feel like they sort of just happen to intersect.
Yeah, maybe your position is probably sophisticated than mine. But just to use Quillette as an example, Claire founded Quillette in, I think, early 2015 or maybe 2015. And in the U.S., at least, at that point, you had all these campus protests going on. You had Trump starting to run for office. You had Black Lives Matter protests. And I think for a lot of people, Quillette provided this new independent platform for me to think through these things and to question some things that we, for whatever reason, hadn't kind of had the stomach to question on our own. Not that we were necessarily changed our minds, but we thought critically through the issues. So that was during one series of protests. Now in the U.S., we're experiencing another series of protests. And I think there's two tacks you might take. One thing you might say is actually, like, the current protests, they demonstrate in a way the strength of the dark web, right? Because actually a lot of, intellectual dark web critiques are getting a lot of play, especially something you've seen published in a lot of places recently. And it does seem to dovetail with some of the images that you see from the current wave of protests. But in terms of providing the independent platform and the kind of media business of the media analysis of it all, I don't know if the intellectual dark web in any way at the moment is providing sort of like a robust platform for discussion of dissenting views on the current wave of protests, police brutality or whatever issue. I don't know if they've made any headway into the kind of critical mass of whatever you want to call it, regressive or the social justice consensus or anything like that. It's not like I can go to one of my, more social justice friends and say, hey, I saw that thing you posted on Facebook, but like, here's an article arguing with it, maybe this will change your mind. That's not, that level of kind of cultural capital has not been developed. And I think it's more serves to kind of organize and kind of link together a group of people who already had this desire to be critical of some of these narratives and to kind of think through their beliefs on some of these issues in a different sort of way. But sort of like once you get that group of people, it's unclear how many of us there are and how you're going to make headway into the broader culture. And when you look at the things happening at the New York Times, we were talking about Barry Weiss, that New York Times article about the intellectual dark web 2 years ago. Well, who knows how much longer Barry Weiss has at the New York Times, right? The editor who hired her was fired for publishing the Tom Cotton editorial, right? There is going to be almost certainly a new pattern of hiring people for political orthodoxy in the current moment, with the current protests going on, and hiring people for their focus on taking a certain line on social justice issues. So I think right now there is a question about just what role should the IDW be playing in pushing back against some of these dynamics, and frankly, have they or we put themselves or ourselves into a position where they're even capable of fulfilling that role?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I would agree with you there that I don't think that they've built up any kind of critical mass. It seems like the Eric Weinstein's podcast, The Portal, has been doing quite well and is a really successful endeavor. Sam Harris has used his independent platform to talk about the protests and the recent race relations and the politics surrounding that quite a bit. I do agree though that like the strategy, for example, that I see like James Lindsay taking, where with new discourses they're just sort of trying to produce as much. I mean, really, it's propaganda, but it's sort of anti-woke propaganda,
right?
For you to share as much as possible. And him going and saying, oh, well, if your employer, I think there was some tweet today that people were arguing about where he was saying, if your employer is putting you through a diversity training, like these are like the questions that you can ask to sort of start prying your way, into some sort of a discussion with them. And I would have to agree with you there that I actually, I myself have had to refrain from trying to share information that I'm convinced would logically dispel some of these things, some of these ideologies from people that I know on social media, on Facebook and elsewhere.
Right.
And the reason is just because people don't actually care about facts. The gist of it is you're not going to convince somebody who doesn't want to be convinced. And so at this point, it seems to me like it's more damaging to my career prospects, to my social relationships, to other things for me to take this moment to go on a campaign, right? And try to get all these ideas out here that I've been telling people about for the last 3 years. And everyone's been saying I'm crazy. It's more useful instead to take some kind of alternative approach and almost ignore it entirely and just keep creating the things that I want to create.
Yeah.
And that's my attitude right now. Moldbug actually talked about this recently on a podcast with Michael Malice. He was talking about just detachment. Like, to oppose the system is actually to keep feeding the dynamic where they're sort of feeding off of each other. And I think this is what happened with Reuben a little bit. Like, he needs the SJWs to exist because they feed off of each other.
Yeah, I mean, you get this mutual. Not that I mean, I don't know much about Moldbug, or Michael Malice actually. Yeah, so two things I should say. First thing I should say is, yeah, I think in a sense, okay, I don't get along with James, so maybe I'm being too critical. But look, if you say to somebody, here's
I've had James on the show, so we're friends.
Yeah, so I think there's a sense in if you say to somebody, here, just this impossible conversation with the person your diversity training in your workplace in the current climate, you should think about the fact that you may be responsible for that person losing their job, right? It may not be a good idea for somebody to start that conversation in the current climate. It may actually be very.
It may not be easy for them to get another one, or set up their own platform.
Yeah, that's where you might need some of the old leftism if you want to give a critique of the current economy, or not. Depending on, maybe it's just coronavirus that's obviously making it very hard to find a job right now. And the other thing I was going to say is the dynamics of. So this is something that has interested me since kind of just from starting out with watching Trump, really, in 2015 and 2016. The dynamics of mutual radicalization and the symbiotic relationship between the extremes. And I'm not giving a horseshoe theory, just to be clear. I'm not saying that there's agreement between people who are on the one side and people who are on the other side. I'm not really talking about extremists. What I'm talking about is a dynamic whereby people point to the side as a threat, and the more you convince somebody that the other side is a threat, the more they come to your side for protection. But then if the saying that your side is a threat, they see your side larger, and other people also go to the other side for the protection, right? So I think this is an underrated element of polarization, this sort of symbiotic relationship between the, what you might call the tribes or the sides or whatever. And this is certainly, and people recognize it when they're not the ones doing it, right? Like this was sometimes people recognize this dynamic where it doesn't probably exist. So when Trump was running for office in 2016, there was this, the Democrats would say, Trump is ISIS's best recruiter, right? You don't hear this line anymore. Nobody talks about ISIS anymore. But they would say ISIS's best recruiter because of all the, horrible things he says about Muslims, right? Well, that might not be true, but I definitely think it's true that there was a sense in which social justice people were Trump's best recruiters, and also a sense in which, like, Trump was like the social justice people's best recruiters, right? When you see somebody talking ways that make you feel like you're going to lose your job, but you're going to be sent to some sort of re-education camp to learn about, all the microaggressions that you're doing all the time or something like that.
The value of inclusion.
Yeah, and stuff like that. Or even, if you feel like your job is going to be at stake because of all these diversity trainings and, new kind of rules about who's even allowed to have a job. Then you start saying, okay, I need to align myself against this. And this goes back to what we were talking about, the difficulty in keeping your focus when you join a group like the IDW. The IDW was an oppositional group, right? Like we saw this dynamic and we became, a lot of our emotional and mental energy became dedicated to pushing back against it. And is not necessarily energy that you can just place to think about something else, right? And people want to have energy, right? Like people want to be moved by things in the world. People want to be involved in a struggle or in a conflict that they think is going to make the world a better place, and that they think is kind of characteristic of times that they live in. So that's just to say, this dynamic of mutual radicalization, I think it's going to continue. I think there's going to continue to be this symbiotic relationship, and maybe that's good news for the intellectual dark web, right? Because maybe what it means is, for every statue that comes down, a few new people start reading Quillette or something like that. Who knows? But it doesn't. It's not necessarily good for. So maybe it's good for the IDW on the business side. It's not necessarily good on the side of finding a space where people can hash out the issues and actually talk to each other, because it creates this not creates, but it fuels this very oppositional dynamic.
Yeah, so I guess that is a problem. Is how can they oppose sort of one side of the spectrum without increasing the polarization? Like this show is supposed to be, we're trying to figure out how we can get out of this. Really, these are all just various game theoretic traps, right, that we're falling into,
right?
Where you get sort of iterated prisoners dilemmas. You have issues with, tragedies of the commons and so on and so forth. And one of the things that's come out for me, though, is just like I don't necessarily know that when a new statue gets torn down, or when someone sees some crazy, like right now, there's a Michigan State professor. My undergrad is in Michigan State. I have class of 2020.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a very eventful graduation.
It's been a strange time. Yeah.
There's this Michigan State professor, Stephen Su, who's a Chinese professor, and people, physicist, and there's a campaign right now to get him fired, right?
Right.
And
to get him removed from an administrative position, right?
Yeah. And Claire Lemon and the Quillette people have come in and backed him up, and they've actually got a counter petition going that's been signed by a lot of different prominent academics and professors. And it's always seemed to me like, well, the IDW could spend more time, let's say, calling out the right, which they don't actually spend a lot of time on. And their argument is, well, the right wing, the problem of right wing extremism is being overblown, and it's being overblown by this exact group that we're against, which are these identitarian leftists. And what we're actually trying to do as our meta project is stop the identitarian leftists from making our entire political landscape saturated with identity politics, because that will bring on the far right identity politics, which has always been my view.
I certainly think it's true. That's just the same symbiosis and the same mutual radicalization that we were talking about before. If you can't have identity politics of without at least some elements of the majority thinking that they should get their own identity politics.
It's just delusional to think that you're going to convince white people to not have their own identity politics. By telling them that that's racist. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, the way you would do it if you could convince them of ideas like liberal individualism and colorblindness and things like that. And I tend to think some of those ideas, are underrated by the current social justice left, right? Some of those ideas had made a lot of headway and had made progress in people's thinking about members of other groups. And I think that throwing the baby out with the bathwater that the identity politics crowd did. And I think actually some of them would acknowledge that as well. Some of them would say, look, it's true that we tried to replace color blindness, and maybe some of the things that replaced it were worse than it. That's something they're willing to acknowledge. But I think I interrupted you.
Oh, well, I mean, no, I definitely agreed with that. All I was saying was that so one of the things that got me started on Twitter, actually, I mean, I was originally there to study like computer science stuff, but that's besides the point. When I started getting concerned about the identity left, I also started to explore what was going on in the dissident right. And I'll just use the dissident right as a catch-all phrase for far right or alt-right or whatever you want to call it. These are, and libertarians are somewhat included in this, so it's not like they're all Nazis, but it's basically anyone who's identifies as being on the right, who's outside of the sort of mainstream right-wing institutions and narratives, which are sort of very, either sort of neoliberal or paleo-con, and they don't really deviate too far from either of those directions. Because I was trying, as a Jewish man, I was trying to get a pulse on, okay, well, is this threat of white nationalism, of an authoritarian sort of ethno-state type thing coming out of the Trump movement, is this actually real? Like, is this a real fear? And, my position from the beginning has always been also that the more civil unrest there is, the more racial strife in politics there are, the worse things are going to be for Jews. That's just an objective fact in every
as country. Also a Jew, I completely agree. Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people that I talk to, especially my non-Jewish friends, seem to understand this fact. They actually interpret this as, oh, I'm defending my whiteness, and I'm concerned about the loss of white majorities, or the denigration of white culture. And to be fair, I think there are legitimate grievances that the white identitarians have. When I follow some of them on Twitter, some of them that are actually explicitly anti-Semitic, and they're confused, obviously, about the way that a lot of the world works.
A lot of things, yeah.
But they do have some things that they complain about that are not wrong, and that as a Jew I can empathize with, because I can see that turning into a kind of resentment that just grows and grows until one day it becomes violent.
Yeah, I think Jews are in an interesting place. I've always thought, look, like there's a group among whom white is bad, right? And what do they think Jews are? They think Jews are white. And there's a group among whom being non-white. And what do they think? They think Jews are non, right? Yeah. So you want to talk about being politically homeless? Like, Jews are like we're the eternally homeless, of the world, right? Like,
I think that's why there are so many Jews in the IDW.
Yeah, I think that's why there's so many Jews in the IDW. It's very hard to find a place, and we also, I don't even know if this makes sense. Maybe this is like an ancestor memories theory or something, but it's also, we have a cultural tradition of this sort of homelessness and of being on the outside. I think it's interesting what you said about the dissident right. So the first thing I started thinking about was like, okay, I think I understand what you mean when you say dissident right, right? Then I was thinking, well, who is the dissident left? So I think a lot of social justice people actually would think of themselves as being on the dissident left, right? A lot of the most social justice oriented voices would say, look, like Nancy Pelosi is not like going to go torch a police station, right?
Sure, but those are just to me, those are like they're the henchmen of like the ruling class, right? Who think that they're the rebels.
Yeah, I definitely think
there is a real,
like
I think there is a real dissident right, and I think the dissident left, and I think the dissident left as it exists is actually anti-woke politics. They see through sort of the facade of woke capital, like the way in which all this stuff is actually supported by the dominant culture.
Right. So that's actually a really interesting group that I wish I knew more about them to talk more about them.
I would say like Anna Cashin
Yeah, so she was on the portal, right? So
Mm.
that is something I've always thought. There has always been a left-wing critique of identity politics and a left-wing critique of social justice movements. And the intellectual dark web, kind of as an intellectual project, I don't think has ever been active enough at integrating that, at publishing that, at using their stuff as a platform for that, and at thinking through what are the linkages between this, what you might call the centrist critique of identity politics versus the left wing and the right wing critiques of identity politics, right? And that is, somebody like Adolf Reed, who has always been, who says, back 5 years ago said Black Lives Matter is a neoliberal blah blah blah, it's and says things like, you're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic if you're trying to get, there's this joke people made during Clinton's campaign about how, she wanted like a higher proportion of women like bombing weddings in the Middle East or something like that, right? And they're just like, they think that like the issues of representation are like so secondary to the political issues of like, are we bombing innocent people and stuff like that?
Well, it's whether you're more interested in like the symbolic victory, or
right,
in
exactly,
actually
yeah.
changing the structure.
Yeah, so that's the way they see it, and that's something that I think we were talking before about whether the IDW really was post-political, and I tend to think, to be quite honest, if the IDW really were post-political, there would have been more success at integrating the left-wing critique of social justice and at featuring it. And there's...
Well, I think they're straying away. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no problem.
I think, so what I get from my leftist friends that I talk to about this, who are not super woke, they're still sort of pro Black Lives Matter and sort of, they'll say things like, ACAB and all that stuff, sort of jeeringly. But their main issue is that they just see the identity politics or wokeness, whatever you want to call it, being absorbed into basically the neoliberal framework. Like you just get this globalist elite that sort of has these elite cultural signifiers, and as long as you can say the words correctly and toe the line, they're willing to have you, and they don't actually care about where you are, what color you are, as long as you can get the right credentials, you're in the club. And he comes from more of like a Marxist, I would say communist background, and his whole critique of it is just like, well, look, they just aren't talking enough about class. And class is like still the primary driver of inequality. And even for something like police violence, which is on everyone's mind, class is the more determining factor than race. It just is. And people don't want to talk about that because that actually upsets the people with power. Yeah.
And this is something, and this is why, people are worried about I don't think it's ever going to actually happen for a lot of reasons, but people are worried about this prospect of a sort of anti-woke, they call it the Red-Brown Alliance, right? Because of this memory of I don't know the history of Weimar Germany, but or early Nazi Germany, but this alliance between the Nazis and certain communists. But Tucker Carlson talks about class, right? Tucker Carlson has even praised some of Liz Warren's economic message. I think that, and if you the National Conservatism Conference in D.C., where you had people like Josh Hawley and Orrin Cass, I think, speaking, and the Journal American Affairs, which started as a pro-Trump journal, but now has become this sort of basically a journal of, I guess you would call it the Dissident Right. I don't even know exactly. It's just a good journal. They publish a lot of really interesting people. their view is this kind of what they call fusionism. So they just think, so this is kind of a meta-political view. In American politics, you have these positions that are taken to go together, right? You have wokeism is taken to go together with, slightly lefty economic politics, right? And anti-wokeism is taken, and cultural conservatism is taken to go with libertarianism. And so what American Affairs really opposes is, they call this fusionism. They say there's no reason, these particular fusions of views, there's no logical requirement. Why would it be a requirement that the side that has the libertarians is also the side that's opposed to abortion? There's no philosophical reason. There's no reason from political theory why those would be the two sides that's going together. And I think people have this dream in this sort of group, which is not the IDW now. Now we're talking about a kind of different group that has developed. There's this dream of a reorganization of American politics, whereby, the people who have certain kinds of culturally conservative views are allied with the people who have kind of, what you might call radical, or at least class-based leftist views on economics. And that I think, that to me is, like, right now an exciting idea. I think that's something that, it would have been interesting to see how the IDW interacted with it at various points in its history. But also, that's also a very kind of U.S. based. A lot of the IDW is not a United States movement, right? You have people from Australia, people from Great Britain, people from Canada, and people from non-Anglophone countries. So I think that maybe the anti-fusionism is a more classically American concern. Although you see it in Britain, at least, too, no, I don't understand anything about British politics, but I know that I have a lot of Twitter mutuals who call themselves the Blue Labour or the Red Tories, right? I don't know really what the difference between. I guess the difference is just who you vote for. But the Blue Labour and the Red Tories, I think, are taken to be the people who combine the sort of economic views of the Labour Party with the cultural conservatism that you might find on the right side of the Tories. And yeah, this is something, if you look, the elite position in the U.S. has always been a kind of, I don't know if people even say this before, but, in college, a lot of people would say, oh, I'm socially liberal, socially conservative, right? That was like and that's sort of like the libertarian on everything view, right? That's, sort of socially libertarian and economically libertarian, right? So it sounds weird, but actually philosophically it makes a lot of sense. You kind of, leave people to their own devices. Turns out that there's probably more Americans who are socially conservative and fiscally liberal than the other way around. And that's a position
This is the axis on which the nationalists are sort of coming together with the populist right, or the populist left. Populist right and the populist left are basically realizing that they can gang up on the globalists on either side, who are not actually their friends, on their own side. And so this part of this realignment is when you get Tucker Carlson promoting, as you said, like, Liz Warren's book, The Two Income Trap, because they're actually both rationally concerned about, in the realm of domestic politics, like what's the effect of, high levels of immigration and the fact that people can't form families and get married and, have kids. The populist left and the populist right actually should be aligned on that. So that's sort of the anti-fusionist position coming to light.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The IDW hasn't been totally separate from this. I mean, Eric Weinstein has pointed this out, that sort of the old left used to care about things like the family and used to care about immigration, and they didn't have this radical view that they actually weirdly now share with the Democratic Party actually shares the thoughts about free trade and about unlimited immigration with the libertarians.
Yep.
So it's like the Koch brothers and Nancy Pelosi are both in agreement.
That's
on
what
basically
Bernie Sanders said in 2015. He said open borders is a Koch brothers proposal. I don't know if he was right about. I don't know anything about these issues, but that was the stance he took at least.
Well, yeah, they're sort of the go-to right-wing billionaire villains.
Yeah.
They're causing everything to go wrong, just like Soros.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, so like I definitely agree with you on that. One more thing I just wanted to talk to you about was this question of, like, you brought up that you don't think that they've successfully established any kind of independent platforms. Now, obviously, they've started a lot of platforms.
Yeah.
Sam Harris. So let me just preface this by saying, Dave Rubin has a software company, Locals, he started, which is supposed to sort of be the antithetical to sort of Google and Twitter, who are sort of moderating your content, and they sort of promise to sort of, they're sort of like Gab in terms of what they're saying is, we're a social network, but we're only going to get rid of you if you say something illegal. And so you have basically First Amendment protection under that platform. Jordan Peterson has also started a company called ThinkSpot. Obviously, Sam Harris has always been on his own independent platform under his name. And the one thing that I'm concerned about is this move that Joe Rogan has made over to Spotify, where he's made this licensing deal with them. Now, obviously, anybody that's been listening to this discourse knows that he's worried about getting booted from YouTube, right? And the effects of YouTube censorship. But my thing is, I think that this move is going to actually make him more fragile than he is right now, because now anyone that wants to get Joe Rogan canceled just pressures Spotify.
Right.
As soon as he moves over, they now have a node where they can just go directly and say, look, you have a licensing deal with this guy, get him off the air, or make him start saying these things, or, whatever. And he's saying he doesn't expect them to ever bother him. He said they haven't bothered him so far about anything, but I definitely know that the mob is going to go after Spotify, because they know that that's a target that they can use to start trying to pressure him. What do you think is going to happen there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about Spotify. I guess my concern is, when I talk about an alternative platform, look, Joe Rogan and Sam Harris are always going to be okay, right? They're always going to have an audience. They're doing great. Claire Lemon at Quillette is always going to do great. Everybody's always going to want to know what she's talking about. In academia and the media, what you have is a system for incentivizing and rewarding not just, a half dozen very prominent figureheads, but, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people doing writing and thinking in a certain way, kind of in a distributed way, right? Throughout all the universities of the country, all of the op-ed pages of the country, all of the opinion shows, interview shows of the country. And of course, in human resources departments, you have the same thing, and corporate diversity trainings and things like that. So when I talk about a platform, I don't just mean that, like, the figureheads are going to be fine. And a lot of the time, if somebody gets prominently fired, they'll be able to set up like a GoFundMe. Like James Damore made his year's salary in like 2 days after being fired, on his GoFundMe. I think I personally, if I were canceled, quote unquote, I think I would probably be fine. I would be able to, I have enough connections that I would be supported. But that's after years of work of developing those connections, right?
Yeah, so I have a platform that's relatively brand new. If I got, canceled tomorrow, I would have to either abandon this, or I would have to, find some other way to make my living, basically.
or the other option would be to kind of lean into it and use the cancellation as, they're coming to get me, which is all,
which is what it's pretty common now.
Yeah, it's a bit disingenuous sometimes, but it's also like sometimes it's all you have, right? And so when I talk about a platform, I'm really talking about like when that enormous system, of all these people who are being incentivized, and a lot of them disagree with it, right? Like if you talk to your kind of average academic or journalist, they will tell you, sure, yes, I have to say that I believe things that I don't believe. I have to, I have problems with what's going on in identitarian discourse and in the kind of the regressivism and the anti-free speech stances of the people around me. But, they'll say, well, I kind of agree with it in broad strokes. And anyway, I don't want to lose my job, right? And when I talk about like making inroads, I think it would either be kind of starting to develop something like that, where it's not just a few prominent figureheads, but where there's a real kind of system, either like an alternative, like a new academia, or like a new set of journals and magazines and things like that. And like, nothing against them, but like, like Quillette is doing great. It's doing amazingly well, but they don't even have like a print edition, right? It's not like Quillette has not replaced the whole system of the Atlantic and the New Republic and all these other magazines. And the other way to do it would, instead of setting up your own system, would be to have people say, okay, look, you've been very successful and you've also made some of your points convincingly. So we want to integrate you into our system. We want to have IDW academics. We want to have IDW op-ed writers. We're not going to cancel you, right? We want this perspective kind of as part of our broader system, and we want to have the discussion. And I think that although there are a lot of people like that, if you look at the dynamics, that's not happening either. And you can see it with what's happening on the New York Times op-ed page. So when I talk about a platform, obviously there are these people, the kind of central, and this maybe goes back to like the way in which you were talking about IDW as this small group of people, and I thought of it kind of as this broader, this kind of diaspora, right? Yeah, for the small group of people, they're going to be able to make a living kind of just thinking through the stuff that concerns them and interests them. They're always going to have a platform. They're doing well on Twitter. They're going to always have bylines. They're always going to be able to make money doing podcasts and writing. But the success of the people they're opposing and the ideas they're opposing doesn't come from the prominence of just a few major people, right? For every Ta-Nehisi Coates, there's like 1,000 people you've never heard of who are kind of writing similarly, maybe not as well, maybe not as eloquently, but who have kind of similar ideas, who are in academic departments and op-ed pages and things like that.
Sure, but isn't some of that just the fact that these ideologies have been morphing and evolving over, decades? Some would argue, like as far back as the last 100 years.
Yeah, maybe it'll take time. Maybe it'll happen very gradually.
They've been percolating, and so they've infiltrated institutions of power. I'm not sure if I agree with, say, let's say Eric Weinstein's take, which is that sort of we need to take the New York Times back. I don't think that's going to ever happen. I think that what will happen is that new institutions will come up, and eventually they will supersede them because they're going to be hopefully more economically viable. But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we will see. I'm not good at making predictions. But I think right now, looking at what's going on, it may be a moment for some like reflection and regrouping and thinking about, just what have we achieved? I know, like for me personally, in the current moment, for all I've written and all the new connections I've made and all the people who have stuck by me as I've kind of started to say increasingly unpopular things, the current energy, the combination of the energy around police brutality, which is an issue that politically I know nothing about. I don't have any reason to speak out on that issue because I just have no information that could help anybody. With the cancellations and the firings at universities and at media corporations, I just think it may be a moment for some reflection about just what have we achieved, and do we have the sort of cultural presence in this moment that we would want to have to be able to develop a different kind of discussion about some of these issues. And I think yeah, maybe it'll take some time. But at the moment, like, just for me personally, I can't help sometimes but feel that I'm like right back like where I started 5 years ago when I started thinking through these things, right? Like that it's not much has changed since back then. All my friends on Facebook were in favor of the protest at all the colleges, and we're pro BLM, and then we're pro Me Too. Yeah. And, I have to think about.
And they told you that your free speech concerns were nonsense and
they were
leave the university.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have to think about, have I really made any, like, it's a personal matter for me. Have I really made any headway with anybody? Have I really found like a platform where I feel confident putting my views out there? And in terms of the IDW in general, just who is left. If
Jordan's MIA, guys, we don't know where he went.
Yeah. And much as I've been critical of him, he it's nice to have Uncle Jordan. So I think there's just a question of how much headway has been made, how much headway is left to be made, and whether the current kind of tack has been successful at combating some of these things. If instead, as we talked about, maybe it has a symbiotic relationship with the things it opposes and has sort of reveled in the power of social justice, that the more, or of identity politics or whatever you want to call it, that the woker people get, the more successful a Quillette gets, but never as successful as the things it opposes. So yeah, I think right now it's a good time for reflection on these issues. But as you've heard, I don't have any answers. I don't have like a clear view myself.
So I actually have some interesting thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that problem too, just the dismay that I feel when I look around, and I feel like I've been trying to make these arguments for years and people weren't listening to me before, and now that they're all emotionally riled up, they're even less likely to listen now, even though it's sort of it's almost like I'm watching the crisis unfold that I've been trying to tell everybody was going to happen. And my two thoughts are two things. There are two things that we should do as individuals to sort of move forward. One, the first step is to become uncancelable. Uh-huh. So you were talking about this with reference to yourself, where you said, look, I could probably get canceled tomorrow. And given the amount of work that I've done up until this point, I might have a big enough, raft to kind of float off from this, right? And you think that it wouldn't be the end of your life, right?
Right, but my life, I would have to kind of for donations and that, and I would have to kind of take positions that I'm comfortable taking, and I would lose friends.
Sure. Yeah, it would obviously be extremely painful, and there would be a lot lost. That's no doubt about it. And the way in which you'd be interacting with society for a while would be warped.
Right.
But I think that as an individual, if you can be on the way to becoming uncancelable, that's the first step. So the first step is to make it so that you're not economically dependent on somebody else who can fire you or some larger institution that can either put you on or put you off at a moment's notice, and that'll just be the end of your economic viability. So the first step is to establish economic security by becoming uncancelable. And then my second point of attack, or I guess way in which our skills need to be upgraded to deal with this situation, is to move into persuasion. So I think one of the big mistakes that a lot of people on the IDW have been making, people like Ben Shapiro make this all the time, is thinking that the way that you're going to win people over and the way that you're going to convince them to come to your side is through facts and reason. I think that that's an old, rather outdated form of thinking about how to operate in politics, and it's based on this sort of academic kind of view of political history and political theory, as if the way that politics happened throughout history was by, the right argument winning over the wrong one, right? And you and I both know the way that history actually works is it's not about who's right, it's just whoever wins, right?
Right.
It's just the winner wins and the loser loses, and you can argue about, whether or not certain movements get to continue on after they've been extinguished and, they re-arise later and whatnot. But the fact of the matter is, if what we're in is something like post-truth politics, like a postmodern political state where nobody can actually make sense of anything, and because of the ideological bubbles that we're in, nobody can even hardly, have a conversation with each other about what are the agreed upon facts, then the thing to do in that situation is to actually upgrade your skill at being persuasive, because you can use persuasion, which can exist outside the realm of facts. And if you become a better persuader, you'll win people over to your side. You'll get people to listen to you. You'll get them open so that they can actually be receptive to your arguments. And you're not actually coming at them from this super rational, logical frame of, here are my reasons why your ideology is wrong, why the slogans you're saying don't make any sense. Look, here, I've got some crime statistics to show you, because obviously none of that works. And we know it doesn't work. Those are my thoughts on it. That's how I think we can start to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. The trouble personally is just that, like, there's no, the only way I know how to move people is by having arguments with them, right? The only thing I know how to do is critique ideas and introduce new ones, and whatever might, whatever else winning might involve, whether it's, having a nice slogan or flashy colors, or whether it's, manpower to pull down statues and things like that. That's not something where I'm going to have an advantage. Something I wrote in the Peterson Chapa review was, I think to a certain extent, ideological alignment can sometimes come from just people's capacities rather than people's beliefs. So, everybody on the kind of...
This would be more like, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just like, we know from social psychology that the ideology that you adapt is more a reflection of temperament than anything else.
Yeah, so I think that this would be the part of temperament that is like what skills you have or what talents you have, right? So I think when you look at the IDW, there are people social justice oriented who still talk about or talk with IDW people a lot, like Jeffrey Sachs and Chris Kavanaugh, for example, who I'm friendly with. We disagree all the time, but I'm friendly with them. And I think one of the reasons is that they have this sort of, in terms of what abilities they have and what things they enjoy doing, they enjoy doing the same sorts of things that IDW members enjoy doing, right? They enjoy kind of looking at the data and going through the arguments, right? And evaluating these things. And if it turns out, and if you look at the Chapa left, there are people who enjoy misspelling people's names on purpose and like saying ironic things, and telling people that they're, if somebody makes a tweet they don't like, they say things like, you like showed your ass or whatever, like whatever that means. You know, they like saying things like that. That's what's fun for them. And then, you know, like the Jordan Peterson, you know, yeah, so that's like a level of irony that like some of us are bad at. Some of us aren't that funny. And so that's kind of what I talked about in that article. And I think that one problem may be, if I'm right, that one kind of driver of where people find themselves ideologically is what capacities they have. And if it turns out that this capacity for making these sorts of arguments and evaluating this sort of information and kind of, you know, not making up your mind so quickly and kind of reevaluating your views and trying to question your cognitive biases or whatever, if it turns out that that is actually like politically hopeless, then the group of people who kind of organize themselves because that's what they enjoy doing, it's going to be a politically hopeless, right? It might just be unavoidable that they're not going to have much chance. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people don't, you know, maybe people don't organize themselves by their capacity. I could be wrong.
Well, I got the sense that there are two sort of primary things that are characteristic of the IDW types. One is that they tend to be, not all of them are this way, but they tend to be first principles thinkers, and that they sort of want to walk through the logic of what we're talking about step by step from, you know, the initial assumptions on forward, and make sure as much as possible that it's consistent. And then the other main characteristic is that they all have a pretty high on the disagreeableness scale. So they have a pretty high tolerance for social ostracism, for being socially rejected, and this willingness to stand up and believe that they're right when everybody else around them is telling them that they're wrong. Right. And if it's true that the institutions have been selecting against this kind of personality for a long time, which I think they have, especially media, especially academia, the sort of chattering classes, then yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe there's just not going to be enough of a high concentration of them in important places to have an effective political movement. But I'm unsure about that myself.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Oliver, this has been really enjoyable. I
had a lot of fun. We covered a lot of topics.
Yeah. I was going to say, I don't know how much headway we made on figuring out whether the IDW is still a thing or not a thing. I think we did make a little bit, you know, I do agree with your characterization that I think the IDW is a much more broader, decentralized group or collective than maybe I had initially characterized it as, or as could be characterized by sort of the figureheads. And if you include everybody that's trying to have conversations like these, and that's following these various thinkers and trying to sort of figure out what a politics is going to look like, that's not so tribal, that's not moving towards these sort of self-extinguishing dynamics, then I think we could definitely have a lot more people to be included in that. So that's one like really, really big point where this has helped clarify my thinking a little bit. And I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, it was great talking to you.
Yep. I'll see you around.
Yep. See ya.